If you're like me and cars are just as big of a passion and hobby as video games, and you're not already subscribed to Never Ending Project Garage, my other channel where I do car-related projects, you probably should be. A link to it is in the description of this video, along with links and timecodes for a lot of other things I'll reference in the video. NVIDIA reached out a few weeks ago and asked if I'd like to make a video with an RTX 2060. I thought this sounded like a great opportunity to try a video concept I've wanted to do for a while, so I said yes. Thank you, NVIDIA, for the card. I should note that while the card was free, they made absolutely no request for me to cover it in a certain way or to feature certain information in any particular light. With all the focus on the RTX cards revolving around ray tracing and DLSS, I'm definitely going to cover those, of course, but just know that all the opinions in this video are mine and haven't been reviewed or approved ahead of time by anybody else besides me. If you're new to my channel, my biggest video series by far is the Potato Masher. Starting in late 2014, I built a cheap gaming PC for about the price of a used PS4, and I've been comparing the type of experience you get with a budget PC versus a console for the duration of the PS4's lifecycle. I later built the Potato Masher Pro to compete first with the PS4 Pro when it released, and later the Xbox One X when it released, with the same concept. In that series, one of the most common pieces of feedback I get is that people don't think they can reproduce my results, either because they aren't confident they can build a PC on their own, or they aren't comfortable sourcing a bunch of used and new parts for good prices. I understand those hesitations, so I've always wanted to try a video based around one of the undersung heroes of budget PC gaming everywhere. Imagine you work at a giant corporation that buys 5,000 new boring Dell desktops every 4 years as a part of their lifecycle management. That means that they need to offload 5,000 gently used Dell desktops about every 4 years. Many places have recycling programs, trade-ins, or a surplus center where they resell these computers to their employees or the public. They don't need to get a ton of money out of these older machines, since they've already paid for themselves over the past few years of work and by business asset tax depreciation schedules. I bet you didn't know this video would be so interesting, right? Well anyway, that means that you can easily buy a lightly used PC that, while it doesn't have top-of-the-line components, does have excellent performance for the money. There are lots of different options for where to buy these surplus computers, but popular ones include Newegg and eBay. You can pick any combination of storage, operating system, RAM, and CPU for your budget, and there are dozens of sellers with return policies and excellent ratings. Since the MSRP of a RTX 2060 is around $350 depending on which model you look at, I wanted to see how good of an office computer I could buy for $150, giving me possibly the best $500 gaming PC on the market. If you want to do something like this yourself, the main things I keep in mind are that you want a regular desktop PC, nothing slim and light that won't fit a new GPU. You also want to get a model with the Windows license, since that barely adds anything to the price if you buy it with the PC. Lastly, I recommend shopping for surplus computers that were workhorse models, since they'll have better power supplies. A decent power supply is a cheap upgrade, but again, it doesn't cost much just to pick out a PC that already comes with the right one. There are tons of options in the $150 range that are significantly better than anything I could build for the same amount if I was buying all the parts individually, so I settled on a Dell Precision T3500. For $150 shipped, I got a well-packaged PC with little to no signs of wear, running a hyper-threaded hexa-core Xeon workstation processor, so that's 6 cores and 12 processing threads, 12 gigs of RAM, a 500 gig hard drive, Windows 10, and multiple upgrade slots. It also came with a Dell-branded 80+ silver-rated power supply with more than enough power for most modern GPUs, including a 6-pin PCI Express power cable. Now, the RTX 2060 has an 8-pin connector, so one $6 adapter later and we were in business. Installing the new GPU in the Dell took all of 5 minutes, and the Radeon 5570 that I removed from the PC can be resold for $20 to $30 if I want to offset the purchase price even more. Since this was a corporate workhorse computer, the case is reasonably well laid out, and I don't even need to use any screws to install a GPU or swap a hard drive. It's not as spacious as the best aftermarket mid-tower cases, of course, but it's well designed for the overall size of the machine. After popping in the GPU, the PC booted right up and into Windows, where I added my Microsoft account to the machine and installed the NVIDIA drivers. Literally, 15 minutes after opening the box, I had a new GPU installed and was in Windows downloading drivers. That is quicker and easier than just about any other solution. With the power adapter, this is a $506 PC, but I'll round down to $500 because you can get RTX 2060s with the same performance across a wide range of prices, many of which are slightly cheaper than $350. So, how are we going to test the Potato Masher RTX's performance? Obviously, we're going to compare it to the previous king of budget PCs, the Potato Masher Pro. Here are their specs compared to each other. You can see that the Masher Pro is still a good build for the money, but at least on paper, the RTX build should have significantly better performance. I do want to point out some advantages of the Pro that you might not be aware of. Its motherboard allows overclocking, unlike the Masher RTX's board, so while the Pro's CPU is older and only has 4 cores and 8 threads versus 6 cores and 12 threads, it's overclocked to well above 3 GHz, much higher than the RTX's 2.66 GHz base clock. Also, while the Masher RTX has 12 gigs of RAM versus 8 in the Masher Pro, it's 6 2-gig sticks that aren't that fast, so RAM upgradability will be harder in the Masher RTX. And of course, in a few games we'll test the Masher RTX against the Xbox One X. Now, I know what you're saying, this isn't a fair test, and you're absolutely right. The Masher Pro and X1X trade belows in most games I test, and you can now get a 1X for $400 new or about $340 to $350 used in really good condition. That's a great bargain for the most powerful console ever made, and I love mine. I'm under no illusions that the X1X is going to put up a strong fight against the Masher RTX, but since it's the most powerful console currently on the market, it's worth seeing how it stacks up against a $500 PC, since that's still very comparable pricing for most people who'd be cross-shopping with an Xbox. The point of this video is to see how good of a PC we can get for the money, not how it stacks up against a significantly cheaper and less powerful console. That's enough backstory, let's get into some benchmarks and comparisons. First, let's do some basic CPU benchmarking since that'll be relevant to some of the later tests. In Passmark's CPU test, the Masher Pro scored 1,422 in the single-threaded benchmark and 5,316 in the multi-threaded benchmark. In Cinebench, it scored 513. The Masher RTX scored 1,255 and 6,988 in the Passmark tests and 669 in the Cinebench test. So the Masher RTX has a worse single-threaded score because of its lower clock speed, but a much better multi-threaded score. Neither of those things are a surprise, but it remains to be seen what that means for games. If you want to know how both these machines compare to a more modern processor, here's how my personal rig scored with its Ryzen 2700X. Now, on to some games. The first few are just frame rate comparisons for time's sake, and then we'll get into some deeper analysis with the next few. Unfortunately, Assassin's Creed Odyssey seems to have a lot of the same optimization issues we saw at launch for Assassin's Creed Origins if you remember those videos, so performance isn't what I'd call consistent. However, this is a very recent and demanding game, so it's good for testing. At 1080p, the Masher Pro averaged 45 FPS and had a peak of 80 FPS, while the Masher RTX averaged 41 FPS with a peak of 77. At 1440p, the Masher Pro averaged 37 with a peak of 79, and the Masher RTX averaged 39 with a peak of 71. And then finally, at 4K, the Masher Pro averaged 23 with a max of 41, and the RTX averaged 31 with a max of 55. And if you notice, the minimums are really low for all of these results because of the severe requirements for one and some optimization issues. I think that minimum and maximum frame rates matter a lot less than average frame rates because it's easy for there to be a momentary stutter or a section of gameplay that's not that demanding. However, you can easily see there's a ton of variance in this game. It's beautiful, it's fun, and the Masher RTX is marginally better at higher resolutions, but that's about all the conclusions I'm willing to draw. Running significantly better than Assassin's Creed, Shadow of the Tomb Raider continues the series' standard of great visuals with interesting locations and a decent, if not amazing, story. I didn't want to scale everything down on the benchmarks here just to fit in some peaks, so hopefully you can bear with what I decided to do. But the Masher Pro at 1080p averaged 69 FPS with a peak of 151, while the RTX averaged 108 with a peak of 164. At 1440p, the Masher Pro averaged 45 with a peak of 67, while the RTX averaged 74 with a peak of 110. And finally at 4K, the Masher Pro averaged 24 with a peak of 34, and the RTX averaged 39 with a peak of 57, which is quite a bit better. The Masher RTX is significantly faster than the Masher Pro at every resolution, with consistent gains that deliver a much better experience. If you remember my Shadow of the Tomb Raider review on the Masher Pro, I said that it did fine and definitely delivered a good experience, but wasn't a standout in any situation. The Masher Pro looked better and was more consistent than the X1X at lower resolutions, but the Xbox used resolution scaling that's not available on the PC version of the game, making it a better compromise for high-resolution gaming. The Masher RTX can play the game at native 4K and high settings while never dropping below 30 FPS at any point, which is very impressive. Coming out of nowhere and impressing us all with a Titanfall-esque blend of gunplay and terrain traversal, Apex Legends is shaping up to be one of the better gaming surprises of 2019, at least so far. It's also well optimized with low CPU usage and good scaling across both PCs' hardware. At 1080p, the Masher Pro averaged 69 with a peak of 111, while the RTX averaged 104 with a peak of 145. At 1440p, the Masher Pro averaged 59 with a peak of 84, while the Masher RTX averaged 72 with a peak of 100, and then at 4K, the Masher Pro averaged 31 with a peak of 39, and the Masher RTX averaged 42 with a peak of 52. Again, the Masher RTX is significantly faster than the Masher Pro. Both machines deliver great 1080p and 1440p performance at high settings, and if I do a full Apex Legends review on the Masher Pro, I think I can get decent 4K 60 FPS performance out of it with some settings and resolution scaling tweaks. Forever one of my favorite gaming franchises, the last release in the series is still a fantastic looking game almost 4 years after its release. If you remember from my X1X and Masher Pro launch video, even at only 4K medium settings and 30 FPS, the Masher Pro delivers a significantly improved experience over the Xbox One X in The Witcher 3. One of the reasons the Masher Pro was able to do that is because the Xbox's CPU struggled with such a huge open world, limiting the console's powerful GPU more than I would have expected. Interestingly, something similar happened here with the Masher RTX. The Witcher 3 is a demanding game for CPUs, especially in my favorite testing section inside the largest city in the game, Novigrad. It also doesn't really benefit from extra CPU cores as much as it needs fast individual cores. The Masher RTX's slower CPU clock speed is not offset by the extra cores, especially at lower resolutions where the GPU isn't as taxed. So, at 1080p, the Masher Pro averaged 76 FPS with a peak of 105, while the RTX averaged 64 with a peak of 91, which you can see is significantly slower. And then at 1440p, the Masher Pro averaged 62 with a peak of 71, while the Masher RTX averaged 64 with a peak of 86. And then finally, at 4K, the Masher Pro averaged 33 with a peak of 37, and the RTX averaged 48 with a peak of 59. Now, both machines are comfortably above 60 FPS at both 1080p and 1440p in one of the most demanding areas in the game, so on the one hand, the Masher RTX's worst performance isn't likely to matter that much to the average gamer, but if you have a higher refresh rate monitor, this could be a letdown. Still, at 4K, the 2060's extra power more than offsets the Masher Pro's CPU, and the RTX pulls ahead again. While I couldn't hit a locked 60 FPS at 4K in low settings with the RTX, it was pretty close. However, I was easily able to hit 4K, 30 FPS, and very high settings, with Hairworks and all the other bells and whistles enabled. As you can see, the game looks fantastic at these settings. While The Witcher 3 looks great at 4K and medium settings on the Masher Pro, the Masher RTX is a big upgrade at 4K resolutions. Now we start getting into some comparisons with the Xbox One X. The Division is now somewhat dated given that its sequel comes out within a few weeks, and it was given an X1X patch well after launch. That makes it a great candidate for comparing how the X1X handles a game that's not excessively taxing compared to a machine like the RTX that has significantly more power. First, let's compare frame rates for the Masher Pro and Masher RTX. Now, the Division's built-in benchmark only records average frame rates, so to keep consistent I went with that for this particular game. So at 1080p, the Masher Pro averaged 83, while the Masher RTX averaged 89. At 1440p, the Pro averages 57, while the RTX averages 75, and at 4K, the Pro averages 31, while the RTX averages 46. Once again, the Masher Pro's higher CPU clock speed makes a difference at 1080p, although once again both machines are comfortably above 60. By 1440p the RTX is comfortably ahead, and by 4K that difference is about 50%. I plan on doing a Division 2 test with the Masher Pro and X1X, but for now let's see how the Xbox compares to the Masher RTX visually. The X1X is capable of up to native 4K and a locked 30 FPS, and while I can't know for sure what settings it's closest to on the PC, I'm guessing it's somewhere around medium. The Masher RTX can run at 4K and 30 FPS maxed out at very high settings with no problem, so as you can imagine it looks a bit better. In this shot you can see that lighting has more depth, reflections are better, ambient occlusion and shadows are improved, as well as texture filtering. Both platforms look good, but the Masher RTX is significantly better looking than the X1X. In this indoor shot, there's less to compare, but again, ambient occlusion and lighting are noticeably improved on the PC. In this outdoor comparison, I had a harder time matching the two platforms up because of the dynamic weather changing, but you can see differences in ambient occlusion and shadows again. More impressively, at medium settings, the Masher RTX runs at a native 4K and 60 FPS. I did have a couple of drops down to 57 or 58 FPS, but they're unnoticeable without a frame rate counter, and I believe that they were due to high CPU usage on one core. The game still looks great at medium settings, which is a hallmark of many Ubisoft games, and the trade-off with frame rate will be worth it to many people. Another Ubisoft open-world game with demanding performance, Ghost Recon Wildlands puts a beating on both potato mashers. At 1080p, the Masher Pro averages 68 with a peak of 77, while the Masher RTX averages 64 with a peak of 71. Going up to 1440p, the Masher Pro averages 50 with a high of 58, while the Masher RTX averages 54 with a peak of 59. And then finally at 4K, the Masher Pro averages 29 with a peak of 35, while the RTX averages 41 with a peak of 47. So again, modern games need serious CPU power to stay well above 60 FPS, which is why you rarely see consoles deliver good 60 FPS performance without a lot of dips or other compromises. Still, the game is very playable on both systems, all the way up to native 4K depending on your settings. Wildlands is another game where the X1X delivers 4K with some version of resolution scaling and a locked 30 FPS. Zooming into 300%, I have my doubts that it's ever hitting native 4K in any of the scenes I checked, but this game responds to resolution scaling very well, so I think that's actually a smart choice on the Xbox in order to run other visual settings higher. In a long distance scene like this, the Xbox has an impressive and almost identical draw distance and long distance detail compared to the Masher RTX, running at native 4K in high settings. Up close you can see some differences in shadows and ambient occlusion, but nothing huge. This comparison better highlights the differences available on PC, where you can choose from some NVIDIA GameWorks features for enhancing shadows, foliage, lighting, and ambient occlusion. This does look significantly better than the Xbox One X, but admittedly in the same way that most tech demos look. They look great, but not necessarily essential for having a great gameplay experience. The Masher RTX is obviously better, but during normal fast gameplay you'll notice these differences less than say 60 FPS or native 4K. Both of which the Masher RTX is capable of. A good showing for both systems, and the Masher Pro does just fine as well. I just released my Forza Horizon 4 test on the Potato Masher Pro and Xbox One X a month or so ago, so we'll jump straight to the Masher Pro versus the Masher RTX. At 1080p, the Masher Pro averages 75 with a peak of 95, while the Masher RTX averages 94 with a peak of 114. At 1440p, the Masher Pro averages 60 with a peak of 72, while the Masher RTX averages 78 with a peak of 92. And then finally at 4K, the Masher Pro averages 40 with a peak of 48, and the Masher RTX averages 57 with a peak of 67. Another strong lead for the Masher RTX, while both systems are capable of great experiences at every resolution. The most significant difference is at 4K. If you remember, the Masher Pro had to be dropped to low settings to maintain 60 FPS, while the RTX can maintain 60 with a few small settings drops at mostly high settings. Xbox will always deserve the credit of delivering great Forza racing experiences for years, while the PC version suffered from horrible optimization and stability issues, and it remains to this day one of the only racing games that I've ever found tolerable at 30 FPS. I don't want to take anything away from it, and honestly up until this latest release I've always preferred Forza on Xbox. But it's hard to argue with these results. The X1X can do 1080p and 60 FPS, which is great, but there aren't many differences between the Xbox and RTX at that resolution. At 4K, the Xbox looks great, but it's locked to 30 FPS, while the Masher RTX looks just as good or maybe a little better and is running at double the frame rate. Now, I purposely left the game at its recommended 60 FPS settings on PC, which keeps the motion blurring one step down from the setting it recommends for 30 FPS. So the Xbox has better motion blurring here to compensate for 30 FPS, but that's a difference you'll only appreciate while watching footage. When you're playing, there's no substitute for the lower input latency and increased response of 60 FPS, and it's even better when there's no visual compromise necessary to achieve it. The Masher RTX is significantly better than the Xbox One X and the Potato Masher Pro. We are going to spend some time on ray tracing for Battlefield 5, but first let's do the normal frame rate tests of a section in the single-player war stories. Starting at 1080p, which is actually very interesting here. Both the Masher Pro and Masher RTX averaged 69 with a peak frame rate of 81, although the minimum frame rate on the Masher RTX was a little lower. At 1440p, the Masher Pro averages 58 with a peak of 65, and the RTX averages 71 with a peak of 79, which is a tighter spread than you normally see for average and max frame rates. And then at 4K, the Masher Pro averaged 29 with a peak of 33, while the RTX averaged 47 with a peak of 60. Next, let's look at the same settings, but in multiplayer, where you can expect the GPU to matter a little bit less and the CPU to matter a little more. At 1080p again, the Masher Pro averages 82 with a peak of 85, and the RTX averages 75 with a peak of 105, so the RTX has a lower average but a higher peak. And then at 1440p, the CPU advantage starts to go away a little bit for the Masher Pro. It averages 62 with a peak of 75, while the RTX averages 68 with a peak of 111. And then at 4K, the Masher Pro averages 34 with a peak of 36, and the RTX is an average of 45 with a peak of 51. Now, before we touch ray tracing or DLSS, how does the Masher RTX compare to the X1X? Well, supposedly the X1X targets 60 FPS and varies the resolution to try to maintain 60. It's not at 60 all the time, and I very rarely saw it looking sharp enough to be close to native 4K. Here's the Masher RTX at medium settings and 60 FPS at 4K with 90% resolution scaling compared to the X1X. You can see that the Masher is running at a noticeably higher resolution, not to mention the better specular highlights on the snow, higher res textures, better shadows, and more. The gap grows even more when you see the Masher RTX running completely maxed out at native 4K and 30 FPS. The Xbox, once again, is great for the money, but even a budget PC can beat it. Those differences can be very noticeable in a game like Battlefield that's one of the best looking releases pretty much every year. Now, the point of this build isn't just performance for the money, of course. The RTX line of GPUs is Nvidia's first big push into ray tracing for consumer products. I've linked some articles below to go into more detail, but if you don't know what ray tracing is, think of it as if the GPU is tracing the path light would take as it bounces off objects in-game, and it hopefully shows you much more realistic lighting than we're used to in video games. Historically, games have always had to fake lighting to one degree or another, although dynamic lighting has gotten considerably better in the last few years. Ray tracing brings with it the promise of more photorealistic games if it's done well. Battlefield 5 is one of the first games to implement it, and from what I can tell, it's mostly constrained to reflections. Ray tracing does make these reflections look better, without a doubt, but Battlefield has always had really good fake reflections, so it's more like ray tracing makes a good thing better in this case than it's filling in for something that was lacking. Nvidia has also bundled deep learning super sampling with these new cards. There's also an article below for that, but think of it like the GPU intelligently figuring out which parts of the image can be rendered at a lower resolution, and then some intelligent anti-aliasing being applied to make the visual difference less noticeable while giving you some frames back. And I think they also use machine learning and something in there. So that's really important if you want to use ray tracing, because ray tracing is really demanding. Take a look at these benchmarks comparing the Masher RTX against the Masher RTX with both ray tracing and DLSS enabled. Even with DLSS trying to lighten the load on the GPU, ray tracing significantly decreases the card's performance. And while DLSS promises barely noticeable results, this has not been my experience in Battlefield 5. At 1080p, you probably don't need the labels to tell which image is having some of the data reconstituted by an algorithm. It looks very soft and almost painterly like a Photoshop filter. At 1440p and 4K, the difference is less noticeable, so I'm not saying it's worthless, but the visual hit appears to be similar to just lowering the resolution scaling by 25% across the board, which would also give you some frames back. Now, every game's ray tracing performance could theoretically be a bit different, and we're going to look at Metro Exodus in a minute, but is ray tracing worth it in Battlefield 5? Here's the Masher RTX both with and without ray tracing and DLSS enabled, compared to the X1X. I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but in my opinion, in this game, it's not worth the hit. Now, Metro Exodus is another story altogether. First, let's take a look at those benchmarks. At 1080p, the Masher Pro averages 39 FPS with a high of 69, and the Masher RTX averages 55 with a high of 86. At 1440p, the Masher Pro averages 30 with a high of 49, and the Masher RTX averages 46 with a high of 78. And then finally at 4K, the Masher Pro unfortunately averages only 19 with a max of 28, while the RTX averages 28 with a max of 53. So, very demanding game overall, but as you'll see in this gameplay footage, Metro Exodus looks good enough that I'd say the performance requirements are legit. More than that, the game is actually still pretty playable with ray tracing enabled without DLSS, because I don't like how it looks, so no painterly compression, just ray tracing. With ray tracing on, the RTX averages 45 FPS with a max of 67, at 1440p it averages 38 with a max of 59, and at 4K it averages 18 with a max of 30, so maybe about 10 to 25 or 30% slower at any given resolution with ray tracing on. Unlike Battlefield 5, Metro Exodus's ray tracing does have a large effect on the game's visuals. But before we do a comparison, there's something I want to stress. The promise of ray tracing is more accurate, real-life lighting, not necessarily more dramatic lighting. In the same way that a heavily tone-mapped HDR picture might look really dramatic, but not as lifelike as a more normal photo, you shouldn't look to ray tracing to blow your mind with how much the image pops or how strong the shadows are. Instead, look at these comparisons and think, which version looks more realistic and which one looks more like a game? I mean, they're both a game, but you know what I mean. I'm actually comparing the Masher Pro to the Masher RTX with ray tracing, since performance is similar at 4K and medium settings locked at 30 FPS. I'm not taking anything away from how Metro looks on the Masher Pro, or the Xbox One when you see that in a minute. I think this game looks amazing, but the first time I compared the game with and without ray tracing, I was actually surprised at how big of a difference it makes. If this is the future of graphics technology, I'm excited. Next, let's compare the Masher RTX against the Xbox One X. I'm choosing to keep medium settings, 4K and 30 FPS, so I can do a real gameplay test with ray tracing against a great console. Does ray tracing make up for any differences in the settings on the Masher RTX compared to the X1X? Well, I think even without ray tracing, the Masher RTX compares nicely to the Xbox, so the ray tracing ends up just being a bonus. That's a weird thing to say about a feature that to the casual observer could just look like the more expensive machine is more boring, or true to life. That might be true, but I love it. The graphics nerd in me wants to go back to older games and have ray tracing patched in so I can see how their worlds might look with more realistic lighting and illumination. This is definitely not the type of feature that I'd recommend that everyone spend money on or every game maker needs to support right now. I do hope it catches on because while we've had amazing game model geometry, textures, and resolution options for a few years, we're about due for a generational leap in lighting. Dynamic lighting was huge for games' realism, and ray tracing could very well be the next step. The possible applications of this technology for racing games, horror games, even puzzle games seems to go beyond just making things look realistic into possible new ways of even designing games. I know, I'm dreaming a little here, but that's how excited I became after playing Metro Exodus with ray tracing on. I actually recorded for close to an hour just because I wanted to see how the next area would look, so the Xbox One X and Masher Pro do just fine. The game looks great on both systems, no complaints. But the Masher RTX is a different experience for anyone who enjoys this type of stuff. For everyone else, you can't go wrong with any of the three systems. Well, I'm not sure if I knew what I was biting off when I answered Nvidia's email, but hopefully if you've made it this far in the video, you understand why there haven't been many videos from me in the past month or so. This has definitely been the longest and toughest video I've worked on, although the X1X series launch video still holds the record for being the most expensive, I think. So, to conclude the experiment, would I recommend going this route? buying a cheap office computer and throwing a GPU in it? Yes, I think I would, but I might do it in a few different ways. If I'd gotten the same Dell Precision T3500 and thrown a cheap GPU like a Radeon 7950 into it, along with a better power supply, I'd have a PC that destroys a PS4 for around $250 or a bit cheaper than a used PS4 Slim. Or I could buy a nicer, newer used office PC for maybe $250 and throw an RTX 2060 or the new 1660 Ti in it and have a really nice $600 PC that should last a bit longer. The point is, this is a really viable option for anyone who doesn't want to source their own parts and do a build from scratch. The biggest thing you give up is upgradability and overclocking. You can likely swap in a nicer CPU from the same socket, but you can't overclock it, and depending on the PC, it may not use a standard motherboard layout, so you might not be able to swap in a new motherboard. I could still transplant the GPU, power supply, hard drive, and a few other small pieces into a new case if I want to upgrade the Masher RTX's CPU, motherboard, and RAM to something newer in the future. The Masher RTX is obviously more powerful than the Masher Pro and Xbox One X, although the extra CPU cores ended up not mattering as much as I was hoping, given the Xeon's lower clock speed. I don't plan on adding a third potato masher to the long-term testing group, that would just be way too unmanageable for videos, and the purpose of the series is comparisons against the PS4 and the Xbox One X. The Masher RTX is probably going to move to the basement to live out its days as an ARMA and Plex server, dreaming of past gaming glory and spreadsheets. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.